So there's two fundamental reasons that AI will fail at construction management tasks. And these are unconstrained reasoning and generic data. Unconstrained reasoning is where you give AI a massive task with no checkpoints in between. Say for example, I take the bid documents a client has sent me and I say attached bid documents I need to respond to. Can you please prepare an estimate and submission for this bid? This is a massive task. You think all the steps AI has to work through to prepare an estimate. It has to read and interpret the bid documents, see what information is available, map out a plan to build the estimate, create a pricing schedule, go through and prepare detailed workings. It's going to come up with production rates. Well, it's going to come up with how we actually want to deliver it, whether we're using subcontractor quote, whether we're using subcontractors or self-performing. Obviously, it doesn't have access to any of our subcontractor pricing. So as it does this, it's taking more and more steps, and each step there's a risk it does it wrong, and it's also going to come up with the data to do it. So I can demonstrate why it's going to fail at this task with simple maths. If we say each step in this process, there is a 90% chance it does roughly what we want it to. Now that realistically it's probably lower than 90% because we're not talking about it hallucinating or making stuff up. We're just talking about whether it does it in the format and style we want it to do. So we say this step process of preparing an estimate involves 20 steps. We've got to understand the bid documents, you've got to create a pricing schedule, you've got to do it in a template that we want it to. Again, it probably actually has way more than 20 steps when you think about coming up with production rates and all this stuff, but that more relates to the generic data problem I'll talk about. If it's got a 90% of chance of doing each step right, that means if it's going to do 20 steps, we have to do 0.9 to the power of 20, because the chance that it's doing the entire workflow correct is 0.9 times 0.9 times 0.9, which gives basically a 10% chance that by the time it gets to step number 20, it has a 10% chance it will have done what it wants. If we realistically preparing an estimate, by the time you're coming up with all the data that goes into it, it's probably more like 50 steps. So you've got a 0.5% chance that it does this process correctly. And so this is a massive task. So we're asking it to basically do unconstrained reasoning where it's got to come up with all the data. It's got to do this entire process. The next reason that AI is going to fail at this task is because of the generic data within the models. These models were simply trained on all of the data on the internet. Everything from Reddit forums to Pride and Prejudice to random production rates that maybe are listed on some different websites. So it's basically just got this massive corpus of training data, and a lot of it, not a lot of it, none of it will match the specific data from our company, our cost rates, our production rates, all this information. So if I create a new chat and I say, what is a reasonable production rate for formwork installation? This is just going to be in this massive library of training data. It's saying footings and ground beams around 15 to 25 meters squared of contact area per carpenter per day. Now, we don't like that 15 to 25 meters squared. We don't know if that is the productive rate or non-productive time, whether a day is 8 hours or 10 hours. We might want it in imperial, not metric. There's all these different variables that factor into this. So when we're asking AI to come up with this data, it is almost certainly not going to match the data that we want it to do the task. So if I do another example and I say, what is a reasonable hourly rate for a carpenter in Melbourne, Australia? Again, it's so if let's say $45 to $55 per hour as base wage. So again, we might have different on costs to this. So it's saying true cost is around $65 to $85 an hour. If you're working on an infrastructure job, I know those rates would be incredibly low. So Again, generic data leads to bad results. So the way we can improve this process, again, I'll use the example of preparing an estimate, is to basically to break the task down into discrete steps. So if we say preparing an estimate, we want it to extract the requirements from the bid documents. We then want it to create a pricing schedule. We then want it to go through and do the workings. And at each stage, we're auditing the output, checking what it's done, and giving it feedback. So again, we're breaking those 20 steps down into 2 or 3 steps at a time, which means the chance that we get to a good output, we correct any mistakes, the entire process is going to be much more accurate. The second thing we need to do is we always need to give it the input data to do the task. So we're asking it to prepare an estimate. We give it subcontracted quotes, cost rates, production rates, all of this underlying data and information. And using those 2 principles, we can get much more reliable and high quality output out of AI.